If you can answer these 8 questions, you are going to be well prepared for your social work interview. If you're new here, my name is Michelle, and I'm the founder of MSW Helper. MSW Helper is a resource hub for aspiring social workers. We support the next generation of social workers by helping them with their grad school applications, social work resumes, and we provide a ton of free resources to help you prepare for the next step in your career. Visit the MSW Helper website for lots of free resources to help you on your job search. Let's dive in. The first question that many employers ask is, tell us about your experience with crisis and risk. They ask this question because they want to gain an understanding of how you react in difficult situations. As social workers, we are often going to be in situations where we have to make a snap decision. And so in the interview, it's really important to be able to provide examples of times when you were able to demonstrate a high level of critical thinking and solve problems really quickly. One theme that you are going to notice across this video is that I almost always recommend providing an example or telling a story about a time when you did the thing that they're asking about. Instead of just broadly saying your skill set and the qualifications that you have, and maybe like job duties that you had in the past, get super specific. So if I was answering a question about crisis and risk, I might talk about the time when I was in my master's placement and I had a client come in who was extremely upset about something beyond any of our control. And, it at first it was something that I emotionally reacted to. I was really on edge. I didn't know how to react. I was almost like deer in the headlights. And how I navigated through that situation to support the client, to make sure that everybody else was safe and really help bring that client back down and get him the support that he needs, as well as managing my own emotions and how I was able to really, feel the emotion, center myself, and then decide what I needed to do in that heightened state. Being able to share specific examples really shows the interviewer that you have applied the thing that they are asking about. Now, obviously, be careful about, when you're sharing examples, you don't want to do anything that compromises confidentiality with your past clients. So if you are wary about providing a specific example and worried that maybe you might overshare a little too much, try to think of some patterns or some recurring themes that you had in your past roles that you can share on a more broad level. Question number 2 is, what social work theories do you align with? The reason that interviewers might ask this question is to test your knowledge that you gained throughout your schooling and really get an understanding of your values as a social worker. So that's, just something to think about ahead of time, is when you're doing work with clients, what theories really underpin your practice. For me, I would say that systems theory is really something that I always keep in mind whenever I'm working with somebody. Even if I'm doing, therapy on a one-to-one level, I'm always thinking about the bigger picture that might be coloring that person's experience that goes so much deeper than their individual pathology or challenges that they're facing. So yeah, I would definitely be sure to look up some theories and make sure that when that question comes up, then you kind of already will have an answer in mind. You won't be blanking out and forgetting every single theory that exists. Question number 3 is, tell us about an ethical dilemma that you faced. Again, that's something that you are going to want to have a few stories to share so that you can easily recall them, and so that you're not scrambling to think of something in the interview process. So for me, I usually tell a story about how I had a client when I first started as a social worker who, what I thought was in their best interest was against what their own desires were. And so I really had a conflict between client best interests and client self-determination. And when I'm discussing that experience with the interviewers, I'm going to want to really walk them through it. What was happening? Um, what was the conflict? And ultimately, how did I work through it? And what conclusion did I come to? How did I respect the client's boundaries by making sure, while also making sure that like their best interests were at least acknowledged? Um, and also, like, was that a learning experience? Is there something that I maybe would have done differently now as someone who has a few years of experience in the field? When they ask questions about ethics, they really want to gain an understanding of your critical thinking skills, your ability to self-reflect, and also your alignment with social work values. At the end of the day, if they hire you for the role, they're going to be leaving you to do a lot of make a lot of decisions about how you're going to proceed with clients. And so they want to feel confident that you have the skills to really work through ethical dilemmas and seek support if needed. Question number 4 is, tell us about a time that you had a disagreement with a colleague or a supervisor in a professional setting. I find a lot of people make the mistake of trying to circumvent that and say, like, I've never had an issue, and I'm a team player and I get along with everybody. But that's not what they're looking for when they're asking that. One theme that you're going to see with a lot of these questions is that they really want to understand your critical thinking skills. So you really want to provide like an example of a time when you had a disagreement. And again, like, talk about what happened, what the disagreement was about, how you ended up, uh, like what the pros and cons, what the possible actions were, and then like how you ultimately ended up resolving the conflict, and if there was anything else that you would do differently in the future. Question number 5 is, what clients do you find challenging to work with? And this can be a tricky question because, you don't want to necessarily say that like there's an entire group of people that you feel uncomfortable with. And I think that's, if we're not prepared, like sometimes we'll end up kind of saying something along those lines. What I really want you to think about is, instead of what client do you have challenges working with, what situation do you have difficulties with yourself? So for me, I sometimes will share a story about how um, I had a client in the past who would often make inappropriate remarks about my body towards me. Um, and it made me extremely uncomfortable, and I felt really like I didn't know how to react because I didn't want to damage the rapport with the client, but I also knew that like it was completely inappropriate what that client was saying. So I really struggled to like assert boundaries in that situation. And then I might talk about how, how I have learned and how I'm working on like having those conversations and maintaining those boundaries. And I might talk about that the fact that I still find it uncomfortable and that it is really hard for me still to, when that comes up, to navigate boundaries and kind of work through that situation. So see how I'm not necessarily like talking about a whole specific subgroup of people. Actually, I'm making it more about myself and my own discomfort with specific situations and how I'm working on moving through it. Number 6 is, what are your greatest strengths and weaknesses as a social worker? I find this question gets asked in like a few different ways. Sometimes they'll only ask about strengths, sometimes they'll only ask about weaknesses, sometimes they'll ask for a few different attributes, and then sometimes they'll just ask about one. So what I recommend doing is listing out a few points under strengths and weaknesses that you can pull from. And once again, make sure that you have examples to share. Like if you say that one of your strengths is in communication, provide an example of a time when you communicated in a strong way. And then the other thing about weaknesses is sometimes people will make the mistake of almost like humble bragging and like saying something that sounds like a weakness, but it's actually kind of a positive thing, like saying that you are a perfectionist or you just you work too hard and stuff like that. So you want to make sure that you are actually really diving deep into that question and talking about what you struggle with as a social worker. And this really comes back to the idea of demonstrating your critical thinking skills. Employers know that as social workers, we are not perfect and that we are humans and that we all have flaws. And if we are not aware and can't communicate what our areas of weakness are, we can't work on them. So, I would really advise you to be real when answering that question. Um, that's where that example about boundaries might come in, right? You might decide to talk about sometimes I struggle to set boundaries and have difficult conversations. And then you want to talk about like an example of a time when that happened and also like what you're doing to work on that thing. So yeah, definitely don't like avoid the question or try to reframe it as something that is more of a positive. Number 7 is why are you a good fit for this role? My biggest piece of advice is when you are answering that question, like what would you say to your friend or family member when you are excited and telling them about a role, right? Like, I don't know about you, but when I see something that I'm like, oh my God, this is for me, I'm going to break it down with my family and friends and be like, I would be so good at this because I have experience in X, Y, and Z, and I'm interested in doing that. And like, I think that I have a really good chance of doing like really well in this job. At the end of the day, like you are speaking to an actual person at the other end of that table, and they want you to succeed too, and they want you to be a good fit for the role. So communicate that. Just tell them like why you think that you are a great fit for the role. The last common question in social work interviews is, do you have any questions for us? And you should always have questions at the end of the interview. So, the first thing you want to do when it comes to answering questions is fill in any gaps about the role. Hopefully, by the end of the interview, like you'll have more information about like what the day-to-day will look like, what your roles and responsibilities are. But if there's anything that you're still wondering about, that should be when you're asking those questions. Asking questions shows that you like understand what the role is about and are seeking like further clarification about like what your day-to-day work life will look like. And it's okay to be a little bit conversational here. At the end of the day, these are your potential new bosses and coworkers. So, you should be getting a feel for them and like what the role and the agency is like, just as much as they are trying to get a feel for who you are as a social worker as well. So make sure that, you are just asking questions so that when you leave the interview, you kind of know a little bit about what you're potentially walking into. This part of the interview should flow a little bit, but one thing I do advise you to do is come prepared with a few questions. Like I mentioned, it's kind of a red flag if at the end of the interview, if you have no questions and you say, nope, I'm good. So I would definitely have a few kind of on the back burner so that you can ask them. And they can be really simple things. What do you like about working here? What does the day to day look like? Can I expect from X? Like whatever, you think makes sense based on like the actual job that you're applying to. So that's it. Those are the most common interview questions that you're going to find in your social work interviews. I do find that sometimes like those questions are asked in different ways, but one of the best things that you can do to prepare for interviews is come up with a few core stories that you can share centered around those questions. You might end up like using some of those examples in other questions because I mean, it never really like happens as perfectly as, as you try to plan. But truly, if you have stories that you can share, it makes the interview process so much easier because instead of like studying and trying to answer questions, you're just going to tell stories, like, and your stories. So it's not like you're memorizing, it's not like you're having to do any research. So, yeah, that's what I have found has been helpful for me, anyways. And the other thing too is sometimes practice makes perfect. I got good at interviews from doing a ton of interviews. So if you're like me and interviewing doesn't come naturally to you, you're gonna have to go through the process, get those no's, and then eventually that's going to help you build the confidence to like answer questions and really sell yourself in your interviews. If you are in the process of applying to jobs, check the link in the description for our resume templates, editing services, and other resources to help you on your job search.